Hi, welcome to this session on migrating your application to Azure Service Fabric. My name is Vishwas Lele. Let us get started. The first slide that I'm going to bring up is the Azure platform. And as you can see, it's a rich, diverse platform with various capabilities. Of course, the focus of our session is the compute part of this platform. So I'm going to zoom right into that. So let me bring up this slide here. This will be the focus of our presentation. The box that is highlighted is specifically what we are going to be talking about in this session. And think of Service Fabric as the next generation of compute platform that is designed to help you build microservices style applications. Of course, it is not just limited to microservices. You can build other applications too. Now, if you look at this diagram here and look at the bottom of this diagram, you will see that I have private cloud listed there and then public cloud, which means this technology applies to private cloud, on-premises, or a hosted facility, and of course the public cloud. The other thing to note about this diagram is that the Service Fabric layer sits at a level of abstraction above the virtual machines. So you don't have to deal with individual virtual machines. You are essentially creating a collection of machines and treating this as a logical unit. And we often call that the cluster. And once you have that cluster, you have a number of benefits that come to you. You have automatic fault tolerance, you have manageability, you have resource balancing, and things like that, capabilities that we often call the cluster orchestration. What you see here also is once you have these collection of machines and you've created that cluster, you can then start packing your applications inside that cluster. And we often call this a high density way of deploying your applications. Now, what is also interesting about this diagram is, even though Microsoft is providing the Service Fabric technology, you can certainly go out and find another cluster manager of your choice and run it on top of Azure. So you can see things like Mesos. And also note here that Service Fabric essentially straddles the cluster orchestration and the general compute IaaS platform that I talked about. So it's a general purpose platform for building microservices. Now, you're looking at this diagram and saying, what about app service, which is at the top right? What about app service? Many of the benefits that you described, I get with app services. I can do high density deployment. I don't have to deal with VMs. I can quickly deploy my applications. And that is certainly right. I think of app service as a vertical compute platform. So if I have a specific application and I want to go deploy it on Azure App Service, whether a web API or a web application, I can certainly go to web apps and go deploy it. But if you're trying to have a greater control over how your cluster is set up, characteristics of the cluster, or if you're trying to build something that can be deployed in the cloud and on premises, then you should take a look at Service Fabric. Before we move on, let's just talk about why you would want to move your application to Service Fabric. And one of the first reasons is that you want to try to get some capabilities beyond the cloud services platform. So make no mistake, I've been working on Azure platform for quite some time, and cloud services is one of the technologies that I've used a lot. And certainly when it was introduced several years back, it was a great advancement over what existed when all other public cloud providers were essentially giving you a VM. So it gave you great capabilities. It had fault tolerance. If something happened to your machine, Fabric Controller would notice that, will recreate your application, and so on and so forth. So it gave you a nice set of capabilities. But then you would like to go beyond those capabilities, because the fact of the matter is that if you deploy a cloud services application today, you're deploying a bunch of virtual machines today still, even though they are managed virtual machines. And what if you wanted to do sort of a high density deployment? What if you wanted to take your application and run it on premises? Cloud services today only runs in the cloud. You certainly have an emulator in the local environment, but you can't, of course, run production applications in that. What if you wanted more advanced capabilities around metrics, around fault tolerance, around testability? Cloud services gives you some capability, but it would be nice to have some enhancements to those capabilities. And last but not the least, cloud services gives you a stateless programming model. And the reality is that the applications that you and I build are stateful applications. So how do we solve this impedance mismatch? Well, we solve this impedance mismatch by writing code that shuttles state to some repository, and depending on how latency tolerant your state is, we might go to a cache, we might go to a database, and so on and so forth. And it will be helpful to have some state management capabilities built into the platform. The other reason you want to move to Service Fabric is because of the advent of a programming model known as microservices, which has been gaining a lot of prominence. The idea behind microservices is simple. You're essentially applying the single responsibility principle, the solid object-oriented design principle, to a service. So you're essentially taking that piece of code and running that as an autonomous unit. And many companies who've moved to the cloud have found that just lifting and shifting their monolithic applications to the cloud may not be the best way to do that. And what they're finding is it's much better to have this collection of microservices. It turns out that the biggest benefit that the microservices have to offer is the ability to rapidly deploy this application so you don't have to take an outage. You can quickly iterate over your functionality, add new capabilities, etc. But microservices are not free. As you can imagine, if you have these many autonomous units of code running, there is a certain manageability cost that comes with that, and then you have to think about the lifecycle management of these services or microservices. So it turns out that you need a platform to effectively build microservices, and Service Fabric claims to be one such platform. The third reason you want to move to Service Fabric is we want to stand on the shoulder of the giants. And it turns out that Microsoft has been using this technology, Service Fabric, for several years for their first-party services, such as Azure SQL Database, Cortana, Bing, etc. So think of Service Fabric Preview that is now available to us as the availability of this technology to us as developers, the technology that has been battle-tested for a number of years. So now that we have talked about why you would want to move your application to the Service Fabric, let's just do a quick lap around what Service Fabric is. And I gave you a very quick introduction early on. Let's just go a little bit deeper into that. And I should note here that if you are looking for a more detailed tutorial, I recommend you go watch Mark Fussel's session as part of AzureCon. I'm going to give you just enough concepts for you to understand the rest of my presentation. So if you watch the screen, to the left-hand side, we have a cluster, which is a collection of machines. And then we get a number of cluster benefits like placement constraints. I talked about resource balancing. I talked about fault detection and recovery and things like that. And on the right-hand side of the screen, if you see, I have the application package. Okay? And this is the unit that ultimately I'm going to deploy to my cluster. This application package is comprised of a number of services or microservices as we described them. So my application package is comprised of service A, service B. Now, what does a service type A mean? It is comprised of code and configuration, not very dissimilar from what we have today with the cloud service. We have the CS-def and CS package file, very similar in concept. Now, how do you go about coding such a microservice? Well, the way you do that with Service Fabric is you have two programming models available to you. One is the reliable actor programming model. And think of the actor as a lightweight representation of a business entity in your domain. And it is lightweight because the system takes care of the lifecycle management of that actor. So if an actor is not in use, the system will passivate it and then hydrate it back up again. So it's a really lightweight model. You don't have to worry about concurrency because it is based on a turn-based concurrency model. If you are looking for something more extensive where you want to control the state, you want to control the concurrency, you want to control how the state gets persisted, there's a programming model called the reliable service, which gives you far more control. And then there's this notion of reliable collections, and an example of that is a reliable dictionary. And I think of reliable dictionary as a progression of data structures that have been available to us in .NET. We had dictionary, of course, then we got concurrent dictionary, which was a thread-safe version of the dictionary. And now we have a reliable dictionary, which is, as the name suggests, once you have added an item to that reliable dictionary, you can be sure that it will be reliably persisted. So now that we have this application built, comprised of microservices, we go and deploy it to the cluster. And that is where the instantiate arrow is there. And once you've deployed this application, we are now in a high density manner deploying copies of our services into our cluster. Now, notice some blue and yellow boxes in the cluster. What are these boxes? Well, it turns out that the blue box or the service type A is a stateless service. And the way the it is a stateful service. And the way the state is offered by the platform is it creates by default 3 replicas. So if something happens to your primary replica, a secondary would be made primary. That's how the state management is done. So as you can see, the blue box, which is a stateful service, is represented by 3 little blue boxes within the cluster, which means I have 3 replicas. The green service is a stateless service, and I have 2 replicas of that just because I wanted to have additional capability or availability of my service. So now that we understand the service fabric, how it works, let's switch gears and now let's talk about the application, which is the subject of our migration as part of this talk. So what I'm going to do next is quickly walk you through the current application as this exists today. And that application is comprised of cloud services. And then what we will do is we will look at the code, we will talk about the architecture, and then we will look at the migrated code. Now, as I was preparing for this session, I was thinking what application would make sense. And I then decided on a reference application that I built as part of my Pluralsight course. And let me show you this application here really quickly. And the only reason I picked this was because it was already designed around the concept of microservices. So let me bring up that application here for a moment. So I have, like I mentioned, I have this application called Cloud-Oriented Programming Application, and it was designed to showcase some of the ideas around microservices. So it proved to be an easy application for me to take and migrate and make it easier for me to explain here. And this is what that application looks like. Let me just bring this application up. This application is comprised of a number of microservices, and the first microservice is the author microservice. And as you'd expect, I can come in and search, and comes back with a bunch of information about the authors. I can also click on courses, another microservice, and I can type in some name of a course or a topic, and I can go search for this information. And what happens at this point is it is going out and making a call into a machine learning experiment, and which is essentially a recommendation service. So based on the topic, it is going to come back with a recommended set of courses that I may want to recommend to my users. So this is a very simple application: authors, courses, media, all microservices. Let's go back to the slide for a moment and let's talk about the architecture of this application. So I'll go back to my slides here. Let's just go to the next slide. You can see this is the current architecture. And if you're familiar with cloud services, this diagram is easy to understand. I have a UI tier, which is hosted in a web role, ASP.NET MVC hosted in a web role. Then I have a bunch of worker roles. They are hosting my stateless middle tier services. And then at the bottom of the screen, you can see I have a cache, I have a Azure table, I have blob storage. And then on the left-hand side, bottom left of the screen, you can see the dependencies. I showed you earlier how I call the machine learning service. I can also similarly call the SendGrid service. So that's the current architecture of the application. Let's look at how this architecture will get transformed into a service fabric based architecture. So this is the service fabric based architecture, and not a whole lot different from what we saw earlier. However, there are some key differences to note. First and foremost, I took the UI tier and I hosted it in Azure App Service. So I moved that out. And instead of the stateless services and a bunch of repositories, I now have all of the code and all of the state combined inside the service fabric layer. So that's how you see the stateful middle tier compute service. And then of course you have the machine learning and SendGrid as external services as you would expect. Now, if I wanted to run some queries against my transactional system, I want to come up and query about the authors or combine that with the courses, I can come into the service fabric tier and I can go to, let's say, my reliable dictionary and query for that information. But what if I wanted to report on this data? What I can do then is I can dump that data that is in my Service Fabric repositories and dump that into an analytics store and run my reports in that manner. Okay, so that's the other difference. So let us go to our code here. I'll bring up to Visual Studio and let's look at the migrated code. I will call out certain interesting parts of the code. So let us go back to Visual Studio here, and I'm going to bring up this project right here, and this solution here is comprised of a number of services. And remember the author screen, that was a microservice hosted in cloud services. Well, it turns out the way it is implemented here is I can go to the author actor service right here. You can see that is inheriting from an actor service, and it is a stateful service. Let's just go down and take a look at this code here. So you can see, let me go back to the author actor for a moment. I want to call out one other important thing. Let us look at, if I go further down in my code, you can see here that I have the state associated with my actor. So remember that actor is a lightweight representation of an entity. And in this case, the entity happens to be the author entity. You can see here a bunch of state associated with the author. And what is interesting about this piece of code is I did not have to write some data access logic to go to the database and store this information. All I did was I updated this variable called state. And this took care of persisting my state in a reliable manner through the stateful actor model. And one other thing to note here as part of this code is I did not have to worry about concurrency. Remember that actor is based on a turn-based concurrency model, so I didn't have to write any of the concurrency logic here as well. As things stand currently, I don't have a way to iterate over my actors. So what I ended up doing was I created a reliable service. Let me bring that reliable service up here as well. And the reliable service, if I go up to the top, the reliable service is also a stateful service. And in this case, since it is not a turn-based concurrency model, I would have to apply my concurrency logic. And if I go further down here, you will see that I'm getting a reference to a reliable dictionary. And if I further go down in this code, you will see here that I'm creating a bunch of actors and then taking the ID of that actor and sticking it into the reliable dictionary. Okay, that's the other thing to note. So we've taken the author microservice, converted that into an actor, into a reliable service with a reliable dictionary. Let's take a look at the courses microservice. How is that implemented? And let me just bring up the courses service here. And notice here up at the top that this is a stateless service. This is a stateless service because the state is coming from that Azure machine learning based web service. So I don't have any state inside the service fabric. So it's a stateless service. And all I'm doing here inside this is calling the machine language proxy here, machine learning proxy, I should say. One other example to show you, let me bring up the media service here. And here's the media service. The media service is also a stateless service. And here the information or the data is coming from blob storage. Now, a valid question is, why did I not move this to Service Fabric also? Turns out that I don't have too much advantage in just moving this piece of data alongside code, and I can take advantage of a low-cost storage like blob storage and leave it there. And also, I have other opportunities to cache this information like CDN. So that's why I did not move the state into Service Fabric. So this sort of gives you a very quick tour of how I took the existing application, moved them into Service Fabric services, actors, and reliable services. Let's take a look at the UI tier here. And here's my UI tier. And when I deploy this application to the cloud, I will move this code to an app service. But right now, I'm running a local cluster. So I'm just going to host this web application in my Internet Express here. So let me go ahead and run this, in fact. And this code is not too interesting. This is a standard MVC code with a bunch of controllers that is calling into my Service Fabric hosted code. Let me start this application here. And while we wait for this application to come up, let me show you the cluster manager. And in this case, what I have done is I have installed the Service Fabric locally on my machine. And remember, this is one of the advantages. I have this technology that I can run on-prem as well as in the cloud. I decided to host it inside my Azure VM. My Service Fabric cluster is comprised of 5 nodes. And then you can see here that these are all of the applications that are installed. And here is our cloud application right here. So let's just bring it up. And if I drill down into this, you will see here that I have a bunch of services. And we talked about the author service, we talked about the course service, we talked about the media service. We did not talk about the web API service, so let me just talk about this moment here. In order for my app service to access the Service Fabric cluster, I needed a gateway service, a web API layer. In this case, I'm doing an Oven self-host, which my app service will call into. And this gateway service, then they'll call my author service, the course service, and so on. So here is my cluster. I've already deployed my application. Let's just go back to the browser, see if our application came up. Looks like it did, and it came up on the local host. And let's just go ahead and try this functionality out, and you would expect to get the same results. Okay, so we've taken this application, migrated it, and now we are running the same application locally on my virtual machine here. Let's go back to the slide for a moment, and let's just summarize what we have seen up until now. So here's the summary slide for what the steps that we looked at. So our web role, the ASP.NET MVC application that was hosted inside the web role, got converted into an Azure web app. I could have also moved that code directly into Service Fabric. I talked about the Oven self-host. I had to add the gateway service just so that my app service could call my reliable service. That's why we don't have anything equivalent to that in the current application. My stateless author service, which was hosted in a worker role, got converted into a stateful actor, a stateful author service, and a reliable dictionary. My course service, which was dependent on Azure ML, got converted into a stateless, reliable service and continues to depend on Azure ML. The table storage, the cache, those go away because now that state has been migrated into the Service Fabric. The media service we looked at is also a stateless service, and we continued to host the media inside Azure Blob Storage. And then the last line here is we were running queries against table storage in the previous model, but now we can, for the transactional queries, we can go to the Service Fabric. But if you want to do more detailed reports, we can dump that data into an analytics store and maybe use Power BI on top to run our reports. I understand that I ran through this code rather quickly, so I've made this code available. You can check that code out at your convenience. So you're probably thinking to yourself that you took this application, you converted that into Service Fabric, and the application pretty much looks the same. Are there other benefits of moving this application to the Service Fabric? And let me call out a couple of examples that sort of bring that point home. Let's go back to our virtual machine here, and let's just go back to our cluster. And as you can see, I have a 5-node cluster. I have these services that are deployed across the cluster. Let me show you another view of this cluster. And I have a sample application here called the Cluster Monitor. And this is a sample application that shows me a view of the cluster. But this is interesting because it is showing me how my microservices are deployed across the cluster. So if you look here, my author actor service, the primary replica of my author actor service is deployed on node 1. And if I highlight here, you can see there's a secondary on node 2. There's also a secondary on node 5. So I have 3 replicas because it's a stateful actor service. Now, what if I went in and caused some sort of a failure? Let's just go in, because our node 1 is our primary node. Let's just go in and try to restart this node. Okay, let's just try to restart this node. And it is asking me, are you sure you want to restart? Yes, I'm sure. Let's restart this node. Let's just go back quickly to the cluster monitor, and you will see here momentarily node 1 disappear. And it'll take a second to refresh. In fact, I'm going to quickly refresh it. And it'll take a second to refresh here. Just come back to it in a second. There you go. You can see here that node 1 is now down. It is being restarted. In the meantime, if I go back to my application here and go back to the author service, and if I go and search for my application continues to run. And if I go back to the cluster monitor, you can see here that the author actor service, which is right here, the author actor service, which was hosted, the primary replica of that author actor service was hosted on node 1. Because node 1 was killed, the system figured that out and automatically moved that to node 2. Okay, so this is one of the benefits. Instantaneously, I was able to heal my application even though I started this node. So that's one example. Let me call out another example here. Let's just go back to the PowerShell script here, and let's just connect to the cluster very quickly and make sure our cluster is connected. Now, pay attention to this line here. I am now spooked because somebody restarted my node and I was left with only 2 replicas, and this is an important application and I don't want ever to be down to 2 replicas. So I am going to now change this to 4 replicas just because this is a critical application. And let's just highlight this piece of code and run it. And it is going to ask me if I wanted to continue with this operation here. And if I quickly go over to my cluster monitor, you should see another replica coming up in the cluster. So you can see the number of benefits. I got fault tolerance, I got better manageability. In fact, I got a policy-based manageability story. The other example that I want to talk about is I also have the ability to quickly upgrade my application. So up until now, my application, and I'm going to stop this here. Up until now, my actor state here, let's just go to our actor state here. Up until now, my actor state is comprised of these values. What if I wanted to change this and roll out a new version? So in fact, rather than making these changes line by line, I have another project open here and where I've made these changes. So let me bring that up very quickly. And here is my author actor service once again. And in this case, I've added a new property. Okay, I can go in and compile this application and then go deploy it. The other thing I needed to do here, of course, is to change the version number so the system understands it. So here's the version number. If I go further down, this is version 2 of our application. Now, if we go back to our PowerShell commandlet here, and let's just go ahead and invoke this command. And what we are doing here is we are taking the version 2 package and we are copying that package into the image store and we are starting an upgrade. So I'm going to highlight this piece of command. Let's just run this. And this is going to take a few seconds to complete. And I don't have time to upgrade the UI to show you this new attribute. What we'll do instead is we will just bring up Postman when we are ready and just show you here how this application got deployed. Let's just see right now our application has not been upgraded. So we still get these values. As our application gets upgraded, looks like it is now copying that package before it starts the upgrade. And then if I go back to the cluster manager here, it will show us that an upgrade is in progress. So I've shown you some of the advantages of not only moving your application, you recreated that functionality, but you got better fault tolerance, you got a policy-based management, and then you got a rapid upgrade. Let's just go back to this slide here and talk about what are the advantages. Let's just recap the advantages that we saw here. So in our existing application, which is cloud services powered, every time I spin up the application, I had to create a stack of virtual machines. Okay? And I could not deploy my applications in a high density manner. With Service Fabric, once I have set up the cluster on-prem or in the cloud, I can very easily deploy multiple applications so I can reduce my operating costs. The other benefit I have is that I have removed some of the moving parts in my application, so I don't have the data access logic. I don't go to the cache tier or the database tier. All of that logic has been moved into one tier, so I've co-located data and logic. As a result, I can expect better response time, less moving parts. The other benefit that I have is, and I showed this to you, is the deployment, initial deployment in cloud services, then upgrade took a while, several minutes. And here, I showed you how I was able to make some of these changes relatively quickly, so I can do more rapid granular release cycles. The other benefit that I want to talk about is previously I had limited lifecycle management capabilities. So I had some fault recovery, but I really did not have the health metrics, or I did not have the testability, and I had to work with the older style API to automate my application. And now I have better capabilities all around for lifecycle management of my application. And as a result, I can expect a lower total cost of ownership for this application. And last but not the least is, previously, I only had a cloud-based deployment, and now I have the ability to move my application, the flexibility to move my application between on-prem, a hosted facility, or in the cloud. So let's go back and see. A few moments have passed, and let's see if our cluster did upgrade. And looks like we did get the version 2.0 deployed. Let's go to the PowerShell console here and see what's happening here. You can see here the application got deployed, and then we started the upgrade without bringing our service down. And that's really the benefit of microservices. And to prove to you that we have now deployed version 2 of the application, and remember, the only change we made was we added an attribute to our author actor. And we don't have time to go change the UI and show you that attribute. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to bring up a tool called Postman that I'm sure you're familiar with. And we are going to directly call our author actor service and see if that property did indeed get added. So let me just go over to the author actor, and let's just do a get on it. And it comes back, and there you see it. The last time we ran it, this property was not available. This becomes available now by virtue of that rolling upgrade that got successfully completed. So if I go back to Visual Studio here, and I wanted to show you this capability, how seamless it is to deploy to a local cluster versus the cluster in the cloud. So bring up the right project here, and let's just bring up our application here. And if you right click and you say publish, right now I have been publishing to the local cluster. I can very easily go ahead and deploy it to a cloud-based cluster. In fact, let me just show you that cloud-based cluster here really quickly. And here is an example of a cloud-based cluster. So much like I deployed Service Fabric on my local machine, I can go to the Azure portal. I created a cluster of 5 machines. And once my cluster was provisioned, I can go back and enter that information, come back to Visual Studio here, and I can simply deploy my application to the cloud. So this brings us to the conclusion of this presentation. Hopefully, you understand the benefits of Service Fabric, and you have a taste for how to take your existing applications and move it to Service Fabric. And as I said earlier, I've made the code available to you. So please look at the code and reach out if you have any further questions. Thank you very much.